The sound of the slap cracked through the band's saxophone solo, through the laughter near the bar, through every conversation in that tent. Every head turned toward us. My cheek was burning before I even understood what had happened. Then Renee Calloway raised her hand and slapped me again, harder, in front of 120 wedding guests. That was the night I called my sister. That was the night everything changed for her, not for me. To understand why a 54-year-old woman in a beaded silver gown stood under a reception tent and struck her own son's new sister-in-law, twice in front of everyone she had spent a year planning to impress. You need to understand the 4 months before that wedding, and you need to understand who I am, because Renee Calloway badly miscalculated who she was hitting. My name is Dana Whitlock. I am 37 years old. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my professional life finding money that other people think is hidden well enough to disappear. I have spent 14 years learning how people lie with numbers, and I have gotten very good at it. I tell you this now because it matters enormously to what happens next. My younger sister, Mia, is 29. She is warm in a way I've never quite managed to be, the kind of person strangers tell their problems to on airplanes. She had been dating a man named Connor Calloway for 2 years before he proposed, and I liked him. I want to say that clearly. Connor was decent, a little soft-spoken, an architect at a mid-sized firm in Cleveland. The problem was never Connor. The problem was his mother. Renee Calloway had opinions about everything involving her son's wedding, and she expressed them the way some people breathe, constantly and without apparent effort. She had opinions about the venue, which she ultimately took over planning entirely after a series of long, exhausting phone calls with Mia that always ended with Mia agreeing to whatever Renee wanted. She had opinions about Mia's dress. She had opinions about the guest list, which somehow grew from a modest gathering to 120 people, most of them Renee's friends and business associates, almost none of them people Mia had ever met. I watched this happen from a slight distance for most of those 2 years, the way an older sister does when she has her own demanding career and does not want to be the difficult one who criticizes someone else's future mother-in-law. I gave Mia advice when she asked for it. I told her more than once that Renee's habit of describing Mia's job, she managed an event space downtown, as something cute that Mia could do until she settled down properly was not an accident. Mia always said the same thing. She is just old-fashioned. She will warm up. I did not think Renee would warm up. I had met women like Renee before, professionally, more often than socially. I recognized the specific texture of someone who measures other people's worth in dollar figures and zip codes, because I have spent years pulling apart the finances of people exactly like that for a living. What Mia did not know, and what I had not told her because it was not yet relevant to anything, was what I actually did for work. Mia knew I was an accountant. She did not know that I ran a forensic and litigation support practice that worked with 3 of the largest law firms in the state, that I had testified as an expert witness in 11 cases involving concealed assets and fraudulent transfers, or that my professional reputation in financial circles in Cleveland was, without exaggeration, significant. I do not lead with that information socially. It tends to change how people talk to me, and I prefer to be underestimated. It is useful in my work, and it turned out to be even more useful that night. The wedding was held on a Saturday evening in late September at a private estate outside the city, the kind of venue with a name like Briarwood Hall and a strict policy about outside catering. Renee had chosen it. Renee had chosen the florist, the band, the seating chart, and apparently, though nobody told Mia this until 2 weeks before, the open bar tab limit, which Renee had quietly capped low enough that it ran out by 9, a detail that would matter later in ways nobody expected. I arrived early because Mia asked me to help with last-minute details, the kind of thing older sisters do without being asked twice. I wore navy, simple, nothing that competed with the bride, which is a rule I actually believe in. The ceremony was lovely. Mia looked radiant. Connor cried, which I respected. Renee sat in the front row in silver, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief in a performance I recognized instantly, because I have watched a great many people perform sincerity for an audience in my professional life, and Renee was doing it for the photographer specifically. The reception started well enough. Toasts, dinner, the usual rhythm of these things. I was seated at a table near the back with some of Connor's cousins, pleasant people, mildly bored, the way wedding guests at distant tables tend to be. I had no intention of being anywhere near the center of attention that night. That changed around 8:30. I had gone to find Mia near the gift table because she had texted me asking where the card box had gone. A small logistical question, nothing dramatic. Renee was standing near that same table talking to two women I did not recognize. And as I approached, I heard my sister's name come out of Renee's mouth in a tone I had heard her use before, the tone she used when she thought nobody important was listening. She actually thinks this marriage changes anything about her financial situation, Renee was saying to the two women, her voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they want an insult to sound like an observation. Connor's trust fund is not going anywhere near her family's debts. I made that very clear to my attorney before the prenup was finalized. I stopped walking. The two women glanced at me, then at Renee, with the specific discomfort of people who have just realized the subject of the conversation is standing directly behind them. I said calmly, "What debts would those be, Renee? I would be curious to hear which financial situation you are referring to, since I am the one who handles my family's finances professionally." Renee turned, and for half a second something flickered across her face. The recalibration of someone who has just realized they said something out loud that they meant to say quietly. Then it hardened into something else entirely, something that looked almost relieved to have a direct target. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm referring to," she said, her voice rising now, no longer caring who heard. "Mia told me herself that your father's business went under 3 years ago, that your parents nearly lost their house, that you all had to, and her voice did something theatrical here, pull together to keep things afloat. I am not going to pretend that does not concern me when it comes to my son's future. I want to be precise about what was happening in that moment, because it matters." Renee was telling a story that was almost entirely fabricated, built from a single fragment of truth that Mia had shared with her in a moment of trust, that our father's small construction supply business had gone through a difficult restructuring 3 years earlier, a restructuring I had personally managed as part of an asset protection strategy that had in fact strengthened the family's financial position rather than collapsed it. Renee had taken one true thread and woven an entire fabric of supposed financial ruin around it, and she had apparently been telling this story to her friends for months. I said, "That is not what happened, and I am happy to walk you through the actual numbers whenever you would like." Renee laughed, short and sharp. "I do not need a lecture from someone who," and she looked me up and down with the specific contempt reserved for people whose clothing she had already silently priced and found wanting, clearly does books for small businesses out of a strip mall office. "I have seen the kind of family Mia comes from. I have made my peace with it because Connor loves her. But I will not stand here and be told my concerns are unfounded by someone who has no idea what real financial stability looks like." Mia had arrived beside me at some point during this, her face white, her hand reaching for my arm. "Dana, please," she said quietly. "Not tonight." I should have listened to her. I did not. I said, "Renee, I think you should be more careful about what you say about my family, and significantly more careful about what you say about my professional qualifications, because you do not actually know either one." That was when she slapped me. The first one landed across my left cheek with enough force that the silver bracelet on her wrist caught the edge of my jaw, and the second came almost immediately after, before I had even fully processed the first, harder, deliberate, the kind of strike that comes from genuine fury rather than impulse. The band had stopped playing. I learned later that the saxophonist had simply lowered his instrument mid-note when he saw what was happening, which is somehow the detail that has stayed with me longest. 120 people went quiet in that specific rippling way a crowd goes quiet, the silence spreading outward from the center like something dropped in still water. Connor said, "Mom," in a voice that cracked with horror, and started moving toward us. Mia had both hands over her mouth. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I stood there with my jaw throbbing and felt something in me go very cold and very clear. The specific feeling I get at work when I find the one transaction in 11,000 lines of data that proves everything. I said, "I am going to step outside for a moment," and I walked out of that tent into the parking lot with every phone in the room undoubtedly already recording. And I called the one person who could be there faster and with more precision than anyone else I knew. I did not call my father because my father is a kind man who would have wanted to talk it through to find the gentle path. I called my own legal counsel, a sharp, unflappable litigator named Priscilla Doyle, who had represented my forensic practice for 9 years, and who I knew, without question, would understand exactly what needed to happen and would not waste a single minute getting there. Priscilla picked up on the second ring. I told her where I was. I told her what had happened, both the slaps and what Renee had said about my family before them, in front of witnesses. There was a brief pause on the line, maybe 3 seconds. Priscilla said, "Stay exactly where you are. Do not let anyone talk you into smoothing this over before I arrive. I am 25 minutes out." I went back inside, not into the reception itself, but into a small sitting room off the main hall that the venue used for bridal preparations earlier that day. Mia found me there within minutes, her makeup streaked, apologizing in a way that made my chest ache because none of this was hers to apologize for. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. I should never have told her about Dad. I did not think she would ever say it to anyone. I did not think. I said, "This is not your fault, Mia. I need you to hear that clearly." Then I asked her something I needed to know before Priscilla arrived. I asked her exactly what financial claims Renee had been making, to her, to Connor, to anyone over the past several months. What Mia told me, sitting in that small room with her wedding dress pooling around her on a velvet bench, confirmed something I had already begun to suspect the moment Renee opened her mouth at the gift table. Renee had not simply been gossiping about our family out of cruelty. She had been building a case, the kind of narrative a person constructs when they are looking for a reason to justify something specific. And the specific thing, Mia said, her voice dropping, was that Renee had pushed hard, repeatedly, for a prenuptial agreement that did something unusual. It did not simply protect Connor's existing assets, which would have been reasonable. It restructured the inheritance Connor was due to receive from his late grandfather's estate in a way that routed a significant portion of it through a trust that Renee controlled as trustee, rather than to Connor directly, with language Mia had not fully understood at the time, but had signed off on because Connor told her it was standard, and his mother had assured them both their attorney had reviewed everything. I sat very still when Mia told me this. I asked her one question. I asked whether she still had a copy of that prenuptial agreement on her phone, since she had mentioned signing it electronically the week before. She did. I read it twice in the sitting room while the reception continued without us, the band slowly working back up to something resembling normal music in the background. By the second read, I understood exactly what I was looking at, because I have spent 14 years reading documents designed to move money quietly from one person's control into another's, and this was, structurally, almost identical to patterns I had testified about in court. Priscilla arrived 22 minutes later, dressed for a Saturday night in slacks and a blazer she had clearly put on in the car, carrying a leather folio and an expression of focused calm that I had seen her wear, walking into depositions that ended careers. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She asked to see the document immediately. She read it standing in that small sitting room, her expression giving away nothing, the way good litigators train themselves never to react in real time. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "This is not a standard prenuptial agreement. This places a controlling interest in a significant inheritance into a trust structure where Renee Calloway, not Connor, has effective discretionary control over distributions, indefinitely, with no sunset clause." If this was represented to either Mia or Connor as routine, that representation was false, and depending on how it was procured, this may constitute grounds for both rescission and a fairly serious complaint to the bar against whoever drafted it. I asked her what that meant in terms of what could happen tonight. Priscilla said, "It means we are going back into that reception, and we are going to have a conversation with Renee Calloway in front of whatever witnesses remain necessary. Because a woman who assaulted you twice and slandered your family is not, in my experience, someone who responds well to private, polite correction. She responds to consequences delivered where she performed the original offense." We walked back into the main hall together, Priscilla, Mia, and I, with Connor trailing behind us, looking like a man watching his entire understanding of his family rearrange itself in real time. The reception had resumed its uneasy rhythm, but the moment we stepped back into the tent, conversation died again, faster this time, because everyone had been waiting to see what happened next. Renee was standing near the head table with Philip, her husband, a soft-spoken man who had spent the entire evening, by every account I gathered later, trying quietly to calm her down. She turned when she saw us approaching, and I watched her assess the situation the way I imagined she had assessed every room she had ever walked into, calculating who held leverage. She found out quickly that it was not her. Priscilla introduced herself with a brief professional efficiency that needed no embellishment. "Mrs. Calloway, my name is Priscilla Doyle. I represent Dana Whitlock." I also have some questions about a document you had drafted 6 weeks ago, specifically regarding the trust structure attached to your son's inheritance. And I would very much like to know the name of the attorney who told your son and his new wife that this was standard. Renee's face did something complicated, a flash of genuine alarm beneath the composure, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. That is a private family matter, she said, and it has nothing to do with this evening. Priscilla said, it has everything to do with this evening, because in the last hour you assaulted a forensic accountant with 11 prior expert witness engagements involving exactly this kind of asset structuring, in front of 120 witnesses, after accusing her family of financial instability that does not exist. I would think very carefully about what you say next. Connor stepped forward then, and I will give him credit for what he did, because it cost him something real. He said, Mom, is that true? Is that what the prenup actually does? Because Grandpa left that money to me, not to a trust you control. Renee looked at her son, and for the first time that entire evening, something in her composure genuinely cracked, not performed, not theatrical, an actual fracture. She said, Connor, I was protecting your future. You do not understand how these things work. People take advantage. Connor said, who was protecting me from? Mia. He looked at his mother for a long moment. Or were you protecting yourself from not having control anymore? The silence that followed was different from the silence after the slap. That one had been shock. This one was recognition, spreading through the nearest tables as people began to understand they were not watching a mother-in-law dispute. They were watching something genuinely structural come apart. Philip finally spoke, quietly, to his wife. Renee, he said, did you actually do that? Renee did not answer him directly. Instead, she turned to me, and something in her finally gave way. Not into apology exactly, but into the recognition that she had badly misjudged the terrain. She said, I did not know who you were. I assumed. I said, you assumed I was someone you could humiliate without consequence, and you assumed wrong twice tonight. Once about my family's finances, and once about whether I would simply absorb being hit in front of everyone you invited to watch your son get married. Priscilla said, here's what happens now. You will retain independent counsel for Connor and Mia immediately, at your expense, to review and very likely rescind that trust provision. You will issue a clear, specific correction to whatever you have told your friends about the Whitlock family's finances, because slander against a licensed professional with Dana's public reputation is not something I would recommend testing in court. And you will not contact Dana again outside of necessary family occasions, where you will conduct yourself with the bare minimum of civility this evening did not contain. If any of that does not happen, we will be having a much less private version of this conversation with considerably more people present than the 120 currently watching. Renee did not say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, to me, not to the room, she said, I am sorry. It was not gracious. It was not warm. But it was, I believe, the first true thing she had said all evening. I did not forgive her on the spot, because that is not how I'm built, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of performance. But I nodded once, and I said, we will see how the next few months go. And I walked back to my table and sat down next to Connor's bewildered cousins, and I asked someone to please get me a glass of water, because my jaw was still throbbing, and I needed a moment to simply exist without an audience. The weeks that followed moved with the specific efficiency that comes from involving the right professionals immediately. Priscilla connected Connor with an independent estate attorney within 2 days. The trust provision was reviewed, found to be exactly as concerning as we had suspected, and renegotiated within 3 weeks into a structure that gave Connor direct control of his inheritance, with Renee removed entirely as trustee. The original drafting attorney, it turned out, was an old friend of Renee's from her country club, not an independent estate specialist at all, and that relationship quietly became a separate problem for him through channels I was not directly involved in. I did not press assault charges, though Priscilla advised me I had every right to, because Mia asked me not to, and because, in the end, the trust matter mattered more to me than the slap itself. Some forms of damage are worse than a bruised jaw, even if they leave less visible evidence. Renee sent flowers to my office 2 weeks later with a card that said, again, I am sorry, words that meant marginally more to me than the version she gave at the wedding, though not as much as she probably hoped. I do not think Renee Calloway became a different person. I think she became a person who understood, finally and specifically, that some people are worth checking the file on before you decide to humiliate them in front of an audience. Mia and Connor are doing well. He has been quieter with his mother since that night, in a way that is not estrangement, but is also not the old easy deference. He calls me sometimes now, just to talk, which I think is his way of building something separate from whatever damage was done. On a Sunday, a few months later, Mia came over to my apartment for dinner, just the two of us, the way we used to before the wedding consumed her entire calendar. She asked me, somewhere over the second glass of wine, why I had never told her, in 14 years, exactly how serious my work actually was. I told her the truth. I told her I had spent a long time being underestimated by people who decided what I was worth based on how I dressed or how quietly I spoke, and that I had learned somewhere along the way that being underestimated was not always a disadvantage. Sometimes it just meant you got to watch people make their worst mistakes in full view of the people who mattered, instead of in private, where they could quietly walk it back. Mia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am glad you're my sister." I said, "I am glad too." And we sat there for a while longer, not talking about Renee, not talking about trusts or depositions or slaps in front of 120 people, just two sisters at a small table, which was, in the end, the only part of that whole disaster that had ever actually mattered to me.